Hi, my name is April Fellman, and I'll be reporting on a week's worth of weather observations from Saturday, February 4th until Wednesday, February 8th for my ATM 101 Alaska Weather and Climate course. My observation site is the north side of my home, located in Delta Junction, about a quarter of a mile from Clearwater Lake. Delta Junction is located in interior Alaska, in the Tanana Valley. And as you can see, my observation site has quite a few trees surrounding it. My observation temperatures began on February 4th, which was a Saturday, which was the coldest day of the observation period. Our maximums were around -0.5, and the minimums were around -31 degrees Fahrenheit. Sunday, February 5th, the temperatures increased, and we saw maximums at 26.3 and 26.2 degrees, and our minimums were at -6.5 and -5.7. The temperature increased a little more on Monday at 26.5, and the minimum was at 10 degrees and 11.4 degrees on the right thermometer probe. Temperatures were still pretty warm on Tuesday, at maximums reaching 25.3 degrees and 24.9, and minimums at .5 on the positive end for our left thermometer probe, and the minimum on the right thermometer probe was 1.6. On Wednesday, we reached the highest temperatures of the week at 29.9 and 29.4 on both probes, and the minimums were 21.2 and 21.3. Now, we had some temperatures on the minimum ends of things throughout the observation period that varied between a degree or more. For instance, on Tuesday, the minimum was 0.5 on the left thermometer probe and 1.6 on the right thermometer probe. I attribute that to it being a very windy week, and those probes were flailing in the wind, and the wind chills hitting each of the probes may have contributed to the more of a variation on the thermometer probes than we've seen in other weeks, because throughout the week it was quite windy, so I imagine those wind gusts caused discrepancies in the temperatures we saw on the thermometer probes. Now, the red line with the squares on it is going to represent the times that I actually took my observations at my station. I took my observations between 3 and 4 p.m. each day, and you can see that when I took my observations from my station, they pretty much follow the maximum trend of temperatures throughout the observation period. And I believe that's because we reach our warmest part of the day after solar noon, which falls in early afternoon. So around 3 or 4, it was probably just about the warmest part of the day, just right before it started cooling off. You can also see that mostly the max temperatures follow the National Weather Service temperatures throughout the week. You can see that we started the week at our coldest temperatures, and we steadily rose till about Monday, and then we had a slight drop between Monday and Tuesday, and again temperatures rose between Tuesday and Wednesday, and we reached our highest temperatures of the week on Wednesday. So again, both my observations and the National Weather Service show that we began our observation period on February 4th at the lowest temperatures of the week, and we ended our observation period with the highest temperatures of the week, reaching nearly 30 degrees. I recorded barometric pressures of 991 millibars on Saturday. On Sunday, we dropped to 986 millibars. We rose a little on Monday to 988 millibars, then dropped again on Tuesday to 984 millibars, and to our lowest pressure Wednesday, which was 974 millibars. So we started the week at our highest pressure and ended our week with the lowest pressure, and I believe that's because the beginning of the week was the coldest temperature we saw, which represented the highest pressure, and as temperatures steadily warmed up throughout the week, you saw that pressure dropping into a lower pressure system. So the pressures we see here kind of mimic the temperatures we saw throughout the week. Now, as far as the National Weather Service reported, you can see their pressures are a little higher, and that's because the National Weather Service has their barometric pressures set at sea level, and because delta is above sea level, we see lower pressure. As far as comparing this observation to the one last week, these pressures were a little higher than they were that I've seen in previous weeks. And that's something I'm going to continue to investigate since it was actually warmer this week than the observations I've done before. But despite the differences in pressures you see between my observations and the National Weather Service, you can see that they pretty much follow the same genuine trend where they are higher in the beginning of the week. They see a little spike on the 6th, and then they end at the lowest pressure at the end of the observation period, which was Wednesday, February 8th. We also saw the dew point temperature at the lowest temperature at the beginning of our observations on Saturday, February 4th, and we saw it increase quite drastically to February 5th, and then a steady increase with a few drops here and there until February 8th, February 8th, when we ended our observation period, is when we saw the highest dew point temperature. And the humidity was about 80% when we started the week, dropping midweek but around February 6th to the lowest humidity, relative humidity we saw a little under 50%, and then steadily increasing with a few drops here and there until February 8th, which was the end of our observation period, where we were just between 60 and 70% on the relative humidity. As I mentioned, we had a very, very windy week during this observation period. We did not see any precipitation on any of the days, but we did see some drastic wind gusts. On Saturday, I saw a Beaufort number of about 7, and I say that because there was resistance when you walked into the wind, and whole trees, which in my observation site are big pine trees, were swaying quite significantly. The smokestacks were blowing to the northwest because the wind was coming about like out of the east-southeast. I couldn't see my breath because it was too warm out, but there was definitely gusts of wind that were blowing my hair all over my face. The cloud coverage was about 50% on Saturday. I'd say about half the sky was covered with alto cumulus in all directions. They kind of had like a dullish gray color, but you could see patches of blue from the sky shining through in various areas. On Sunday, it wasn't quite as windy, but we still had a pretty strong breeze. Like the tree branches were moving, but the large pines weren't swaying as significantly, and the smokestacks were blowing to the west because the winds were primarily coming from the east. It was partly cloudy. I'd say about half the sky was alto cumulus again, and you could see patches of blue, but the difference was on Sunday I could actually see some cirrus clouds, a thin, streaky, really light, breezy looking cloud high above the alto cumulus in those patches of blue I could see. And again, those alto cumulus were kind of like a dull off-white color. On Monday, it was another windy day, but definitely not as windy as the previous days have been. I would say it was between a 3 and 4 on the Beaufort scale. We don't really have any leaves being midwinter, but you could definitely see like the twigs on the trees, on the dead trees moving. When I drove past the school, the flags were moving. The smokestacks were still blowing away from the wind that was coming primarily from the south, but it definitely wasn't as gusty as the ways before, but we did have a pretty moderate breeze going on Monday. The skies were very clear though. There were some scattered cirrus clouds, but for the most part the skies were a clear blue. The cirrus clouds were really white and streaky, and they were just scattered in various directions. Not very many of them. I'd say I've written down about 10 cirrus clouds is what I counted, and they were pretty high in the sky. And as I said, the wind was coming from the south this day at about 190 degrees. On Tuesday, we again had a Beaufort number of about 3. You could see the smokestacks blowing to the north, and the tree branches were moving. And again, when I drove through town, I saw the flags moving pretty steadily. The wind was coming from the southeast at about 160 degrees, and my hair would blow in my face, but it was not as gusty or not nearly as strong as the winds we saw on Saturday or Sunday. Again, the skies were clear. I did not see any cirrus clouds on Tuesday, just clear blue sky. On Wednesday, however, it was probably the windiest day of the week. I would say a Beaufort number of 8. The wind gusts, I would say, were probably 40 miles to 50 miles an hour, even maybe. When you walked into the wind, literally it could blow you backwards. When my kids were getting off the bus when I was taking my observations, I mean, they had trouble walking against those gusts at times. It seemed like the winds were coming primarily out of the southeast, about 127 degrees, but there were times when it felt like they were coming out of the north and kind of blowing in random directions. But since I was outside for quite a while, I would say most of the wind was coming from the southeast. The snow was blowing north towards your face. The snow was just getting picked up and creating snow drifts, and again, those big, large pine trees were really just swaying significantly in the wind. On Wednesday, skies were clear. Again, just a few scattered cirrus clouds. I actually wrote down the number of 4. In my range of view, I could see 4 cirrus clouds. Really thin, white, streaky clouds high in the sky, and they were mostly in the south. So it's kind of a rule in Delta, it seems like, that when it's warm outside, you have that wind coming in, those Chinooks coming in. So even though it was a really warm week, we had a lot of wind. And besides the wind, there were no real issues with my observations this week. It was just really enjoyable to be outside when it was above 0.